They were selling a child that morning. Not a horse, not a wagon. A child. A little girl, no older than 8, standing on a wooden platform under the gray sky of Willow Hollow, her torn dress fluttering, clutching a broken doll as if it were her only heartbeat. Among the onlookers stood a man, a cowboy with dust on his coat and sorrow in his eyes, watching in silence, as if the world had lost something he once held dear. And far from the crowd, in a small house where the wind whispered through the cracks, a widow named Evelyn Marsh heard the news. And something deep in her heart refused to stay silent. She wrapped her black shawl around her shoulders, lit a trembling lantern, and whispered, "If grace still walks this earth, may it find its way through me." That was the morning when mercy took shape, in a cowboy, a child, and a widow who had nothing left but hope. And if it were you, standing there in that cold wind watching it happen, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. And may tonight be gentle to your heart, no matter where you are. The wind carried dust and sorrow that afternoon, as if the earth itself was weary of remembering. Across the brittle plains of Willow Hollow, the fields lay quiet under a haze of pale sun and distant smoke from burned timber. The town had the look of something half abandoned, its windows fogged with age, its fences leaning with exhaustion, its streets littered with brittle corn husks and the last gold of autumn. Even the old church at the square, once bright with hymns and laughter, now stood silent, its bell frozen mid-memory, rust glinting dull in the dying light. Nothing here rang anymore, neither the bell nor the hearts of those who had once believed in grace. At the far edge of that town, beneath a sky gray as ash, a woman stood alone before a grave that had no flowers. The name on the wooden cross had long faded, and yet she came each week, brushing the dust from its surface, as if her fingertips could still feel the warmth of the one who slept below. Her name was Evelyn Marsh, 53, with hair the color of tarnished silver and hands calloused from years of working soil that no longer yielded enough to keep her company. Her shawl, black and heavy, clung to her shoulders like a secret she had carried too long. Her face was marked not by vanity or time, but by the long ache of silence, that deep, slow kind of silence that settles in the bones when grief has nowhere left to go. For 7 winters, Evelyn had lived alone in the small cabin her husband had built by the ridge, a place that creaked in the wind and smelled faintly of pine smoke and loneliness. Her husband, Thomas, had died in the mines when the earth gave way. Her son, Caleb, had followed years later, taken by fever in the spring. Since then, Evelyn spoke little to anyone except the wind, and sometimes, when the evenings grew long, to the empty chair beside her fire. She would place a second cup of tea on the table out of habit, though no one had touched it in years. That afternoon, the light began to fade early, as if the sky had forgotten how to hold on to day. She lingered by the grave until the air grew cold and her breath turned white. The crows gathered on the fence line, watching her with quiet curiosity. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and then fell silent. She pulled her shawl tighter, whispered something she herself could barely hear, and turned back toward home. The path from the graveyard wound through the outskirts of town where wild sage grew stubborn through the cracks. She passed the shuttered post office, its paint peeled by a dozen summers, and the general store that closed before dusk ever since the cattle trade dried up. The world felt thinner now, as though every life lost had taken a little more of its weight with it. By the time Evelyn reached her fence, twilight had descended fully, turning the fields into soft blue shadow. She noticed it then, a scrap of paper fluttering against the splintered wood, held there by a bent nail. Her heart hesitated as she reached for it. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, perhaps written in the dark. "A child will be sold at the barn tomorrow. She has no kin. If you have mercy, come." Evelyn's hand trembled. She read the words twice, each syllable pressing deeper into the hollow places of her heart. Sold. The word itself scraped like stone. She looked toward the barn in the far distance, a silhouette against the last red of dusk, and for a moment she felt the faintest echo of breathless anger rise in her chest. Children had once been her joy. Caleb's laughter used to fill the house like morning light. But now the silence had grown too heavy to disturb, and her voice had learned not to speak his name. Yet tonight something old stirred, a pain that was not new but newly awake. The idea of a child being bartered like a mule, unseen and unwanted, brought back memories she had buried beneath prayer and time. Inside the cabin, the fire was already dying, leaving behind a faint orange shimmer that painted the walls with restless shadows. Evelyn sat in her rocking chair, the same one Thomas had carved for her the winter before he died. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath her boots as she leaned forward, the note still open in her hand. The lantern beside her flickered, its light trembling agay. She looked toward the empty chair across from her, the one she never moved, and whispered into the air, "A child, Thomas. They mean to sell a child." Her voice cracked on the last word. Outside, the wind groaned low, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke, as if the land itself was mourning with her. Her gaze fell upon the mantel, where an old photograph stood in a wooden frame, a man in miner's clothes with soot on his face, smiling awkwardly beside a young boy clutching a wooden horse. She reached out and brushed the dust from their faces. "He'd be near that age now," she murmured, "had he lived." The silence that followed was deep enough to make her chest ache. Somewhere, the roof let out a soft moan as wind pushed against it. Evelyn leaned back, closing her eyes, listening to the rhythm of her own heartbeat echoing through the stillness. She remembered how it had sounded the day she buried her son, like something small breaking over and over inside her ribs. She rose at last, lit another candle, and walked to the window. Snow had begun to fall, quiet, unhurried, and endless, blanketing the barren field in white. Under its softness, the world almost looked pure again, as if every sin could be forgiven if one only waited long enough. Evelyn pressed her palm against the glass. "A child will be sold," she whispered again, as if saying it aloud might make it less real. Her reflection stared back at her, tired eyes rimmed with red, lips pressed tight. She wondered who had written the note, and why they had thought of her, of all people. Mercy, it said. But mercy, she thought, was a thing easier, prayed for, than practiced. She returned to the table, set the note beside the lantern, and poured herself tea that had long gone cold. The cup rattled softly in her hand. She thought of the barn, of the sound of men's boots and rough laughter, and of a small voice crying out in fear. Her throat tightened. When she finally spoke, it was not to anyone present, but to the ghosts she still kept company with. "If grace ever finds me again," she said quietly, "may I still have hands to hold it." The words hung in the air like smoke, rising slowly until they faded into the rafters. Outside, the snow thickened, falling heavy across the rooftops, muffling the world into silence. And through that silence came a sound, distant, faint, a creak from the gate she had closed hours ago. Evelyn froze, listening. Perhaps it was only the wind, or perhaps, as she would later tell herself, it was the first knock of something long denied, the quiet arrival of mercy on a winter night. She turned down the lamp until its light was soft as breath, then sat once more beside the fire. The letter lay beside her hand, the ink glistening faintly in the lantern glow. She did not read it again. She didn't need to. The words were already written somewhere deep within her, in the same place where loss and hope had always slept side by side. Outside, the snow fell without end, covering the graves, the fences, and the road to the barn, as if the heavens themselves were preparing a clean path for what was yet to come. Morning arrived without sound. The world lay wrapped in white, as though silence itself had descended and chosen this place to rest. Every fence post and withered stalk of grass bowed beneath the snow's weight, and the breath of those few who walked the roads rose like ghosts that dared not linger. Evelyn Marsh trudged through the drifts, her wool coat damp at the hem, her old boots sinking deep with every step. The air smelled of iron and frost, and each breath burned faintly, a reminder she was still alive. She didn't know what had drawn her out so early, only that her heart would not let her stay behind. The barn on the outskirts of town stood large and weathered, its red paint long stripped by storms. The wide doors hung crooked, and through the cracks seeped the sharp, dry scent of hay mixed with the faint odor of sweat and damp wool. Inside, voices carried, rough, tired, impatient, the sound of people who had seen too much of hardship to remember gentleness. Evelyn paused by the doorway, her gloved hand resting against the cold wood, and listened. A man's voice barked, "She's too small to work and too frail to keep. We can't feed another mouth." Another voice, a woman's this time, replied curtly, "Best send her back to the train. Let them deal with her." Then came the thin, trembling whimper of a child. Evelyn's breath caught as she stepped closer. At the center of the barn, on the dirt-strewn floor, stood a little girl, no more than 8. Her hair was tangled and clung to her cheeks in damp strands, her small hands gripping the remains of a woolen doll whose arm hung by a few threads. The girl's dress, once blue perhaps, had faded to a color between dust and sorrow. Her bare feet were reddened from cold, her lips trembling not from fear alone, but from the quiet humiliation of being watched and weighed like an animal. "No one wants her," someone muttered from the back, shifting uncomfortably. "The orphan train leaves again come Monday. Might as well send her off." Evelyn stood frozen, her heart pulling tight in her chest. The child's eyes were gray, not silver, not blue, but that fragile color between rain and ash. The same eyes her own son had carried when fever took him, eyes that once looked at her for comfort she could no longer give. Something inside her cracked, soft and painful, like a thin sheet of ice breaking beneath too much memory. And then, near the far wall, she saw him. A tall man stood apart from the crowd, his shoulders broad beneath a worn brown coat, his hat pulled low against the falling light that filtered through the rafters. Dust clung to him like a second skin, yet his posture carried no arrogance, only quiet fatigue. His name, someone whispered, was James Harlow, the rancher who lived past the cottonwoods, the one people said spoke more to his horses than to the living. His face, though partly hidden by the brim of his hat, bore the stillness of a man who had stopped expecting kindness. The auctioneer, a short, red-faced fellow with a scarf knotted tight at his neck, cleared his throat. "Any takers? She's quiet and obedient, eats little. Someone must need help around the house." His words fell heavy in the air, met by silence so deep it seemed to echo. The only sound was the nervous shifting of the child's shoes against the dirt. Evelyn watched as James's hand twitched slightly at his side. He seemed to be fighting something invisible, a memory perhaps, or the pull of a conscience long buried. Then, in a voice low and calm as river water, he said, "I'll take her." Every head turned. A murmur rippled through the barn like wind across dry grass. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain if he'd heard right. "You, Mr. Harlow? You sure about that?" James stepped forward, removing his hat. His eyes, blue, clear but tired, met the girl's. "I said I'll take her." His tone carried no bravado, no performance. It was the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had already lost everything worth proving. The girl stared at him, clutching her doll so tightly her knuckles whitened. When he approached, she flinched, then froze as he knelt before her. He lifted her chin gently with his gloved hand. "You'll be safe now," he murmured. His voice trembled just slightly on the last word, almost lost beneath the whispering of those around them. The auctioneer, sensing the tension might pass for agreement, struck his gavel against a crate. "Sold, then, to Mr. Harlow." Evelyn stood near the doorway, unable to move. The scene before her, the quiet surrender of the child, the haunted steadiness of the man, etched itself deep into her heart. There was no applause, no congratulation, only the rustle of coats and boots as the townsfolk dispersed. The girl's small hand reached for the corner of James's coat, her fingers curling into the worn fabric as though it were the last thing anchoring her to the world. As they passed Evelyn, she caught a glimpse of the man's face, lined, wind-burned, but softened now by something raw and unfamiliar. Yet she also noticed his hand, still trembling at his side, as though holding back the weight of an old grief that refused to loosen its grip. Outside, the snow had begun again, falling in quiet threads. The man lifted the child onto a tired bay horse waiting nearby, a gentle gelding with a dark mane and patient eyes. "Easy now," he told her. "His name's Jasper." The horse turned its head slightly, as if to listen. The girl hesitated, then reached out to touch its neck, her small voice barely a whisper. "He's warm." James nodded, mounted behind her, and together they rode off into the white distance. The sight of them, man, child, and horse fading into the snow, lingered like a half-remembered prayer. Evelyn remained standing there long after the barn emptied. The straw under her boots crackled softly as she turned to look once more at the place where the girl had stood. A ribbon of blue fabric, torn from the hem of her dress, had caught on a nail near the post. Evelyn reached for it, feeling the frayed edges between her fingers. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket without knowing why. That evening, the sky turned a color between violet and smoke. Evelyn lit her lantern and set it by the window. The wind pressed faintly against the glass as though curious. She tried to sew by the fire, but her mind wandered to the girl's small face, the way her fingers had clung to the man's coat as though afraid the world might take him away too. Evelyn knew nothing of James Harlow beyond the whispers, that he had once been married, that he had lost both wife and daughter when the river flooded 3 years ago, that since then he had lived alone with his horses, speaking softly to them in the dark as if they could answer. She had dismissed such talk before, until now. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake listening to the low hum of wind against the eaves, the rhythmic groan of the boards beneath her bed. The ribbon of blue still lay on her nightstand beside the folded note from the day before. She reached for it, brushing its edge with her thumb, and whispered to the dark, "Why would a man who's lost everything take in someone who reminds him of it?" No answer came, only the steady breath of winter through the cracks of her window. And yet, in that quiet, Evelyn felt the smallest shift inside her, like the faintest stir of a seed beneath the frozen ground. The days that followed were so still that time itself seemed to hesitate. The snow no longer fell in fierce sheets but settled softly over the plains, turning the land into a white mirror where sound dissolved and every breath became visible. From her window, Evelyn watched the horizon blur into silence, the world shrinking until only the faint curl of chimney smoke marked where life still endured. She had never cared for company, nor for visits uninvited, yet that morning she found herself gathering a bundle of firewood, wrapping it in old cloth, and stepping into the cold. "A neighbor's kindness," she whispered to no one, though she had never before played the neighbor to anyone. The Harlow Ranch stood beyond a ridge of frozen creek beds, where the wind whistled low through the wooden fences. It was larger than she had expected, weather-beaten but dignified, like a man too proud to ask for repair. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, curling against a pewter sky. When Evelyn knocked on the door, it creaked open to reveal James Harlow, his face shadowed beneath his hat brim. He looked surprised, and perhaps a little wary, to see her. His voice, when he spoke, was rough from disuse. "You didn't have to come this far." Evelyn offered the bundle of firewood with a faint smile. "No one has to, Mr. Harlow. Sometimes we just do." He stepped aside, gesturing her in. The room smelled of saddle oil, ash, and coffee left too long on the stove. The furniture was sparse but kept with quiet care. A table polished smooth from years of use, 2 chairs, a lamp that burned with the dim patience of men who read by habit, not pleasure. Near the hearth sat a little girl, Clara, he called her, hunched over a piece of parchment, tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. She was drawing a horse in charcoal, its mane wild, its legs uncertain, yet the eyes were steady and alive. When she looked up, Evelyn saw that same gray light she had noticed in the barn, fragile, searching, and too old for her years. Clara's small hand trembled slightly as she lifted the page toward the fire's glow. "Does it look right?" she asked. James glanced down, his expression softening. "Looks better than the real thing," he said, and a faint warmth flickered between them, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Evelyn felt the hush in that house, the way every sound seemed to move carefully, as though afraid to disturb something sacred or broken. When James went to fetch water from the pump outside, Evelyn knelt beside the girl. "That's a fine drawing, Clara," she said softly. The child nodded, eyes still on her work. "Mr. Harlow says horses remember kindness," she murmured, "even when people forget." Evelyn paused, unsure how to answer. There was a wisdom in the child's tone that did not belong to children, the kind that comes from learning sorrow too soon. Later, as the kettle hissed faintly, Evelyn and James sat by the fire. Through the frosted window, the world appeared distant, like something already belonging to memory. The wind pressed gently at the panes. James broke the silence first. "You're wondering why I took her in," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. Evelyn didn't answer, only waited. He leaned back, fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "2 winters ago, the river rose, took everything I had, my wife, my little girl, house near washed away. I rebuilt what I could, but there's no rebuilding that kind of loss." His voice thinned into a whisper. "Then at that auction, she looked like my girl, just for a second. I couldn't walk away." Evelyn's breath came slow, her eyes softening as she turned toward him. "You think saving her will save you?" she asked quietly. James smiled, not the kind of smile born of humor, but the kind that trembles between confession and surrender. "Maybe I just didn't want her to freeze like I did." He looked down at his hands, large, scarred, the knuckles reddened by cold, as if they themselves carried the proof of everything he'd failed to hold on to. The room fell silent again, the fire crackling softly like an old voice remembering. Evelyn felt something shift inside her, not pity, but recognition. The way he spoke, the way his grief hung unspoken between every breath, reminded her too much of her own long years of quiet mourning. They were, she realized, 2 ghosts living on opposite sides of the same wall. When the kettle began to sing, Clara appeared again, holding a brush too large for her hand. "Mr. Harlow said I can help with Jasper's mane," she said, her voice small but eager. James hesitated, then nodded toward the door. "Take her if you like. He's calm today." Evelyn wrapped a scarf around the girl's neck and followed her to the stables. The barn was warmer than the house, filled with the scent of hay and the slow rhythm of breathing animals. Jasper, the bay gelding, lifted his head as they entered, his dark eyes calm and intelligent. The girl giggled softly when the horse nudged her shoulder, its breath misting against her cheek. "He likes you," Evelyn said, handing her the brush. Clara began to stroke the coarse mane carefully, her movements unsure but tender. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the brush moving through hair and the low hum of wind outside. Then Clara said, barely above a whisper, "Mr. Harlow cries at night, but he thinks I don't hear." Evelyn froze, her hand tightening around the handle of the bucket. The child's words hung between them, fragile as icicles. "He sits by the fire," Clara continued, "and he talks to the empty chair. I think he's talking to his little girl." Evelyn set the bucket down, her heart tightening. "And what do you do when he cries?" she asked. The girl shrugged faintly. "I draw horses, so he doesn't see me cry too." Something in those words, quiet, guileless, cracked open the last of Evelyn's distance. She knelt, smoothing the child's hair gently, her voice low. "You're a brave one, Clara." The girl looked up, eyes wide, confused. "No," she said, "just scared of the dark." Evelyn smiled sadly. "That's what brave means sometimes." They worked until the daylight dimmed into gold. When the final stroke of light left the snowfields, they returned to the house. James stood at the doorway, his silhouette framed against the firelight, his expression unreadable. Evelyn thought she saw gratitude flicker there, or perhaps simply relief that the girl was smiling. As she prepared to leave, she glanced once more at the hearth, where two chairs now sat side by side. The second chair, the one that had long remained empty, had a folded blanket draped neatly over its back, as if waiting for warmth to return. She stepped into the cold, the door closing softly behind her. That night, back in her own cabin, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The sound of the brush through Jasper's mane, the girl's trembling voice, the man's weary confession, they followed her like faint echoes. She sat by her window, the lantern's flame flickering against the frost, and realized the strange truth of what she had seen that day. In that ranch stood two souls trapped in silence, one too small to carry such grief, the other too proud to share it. And as she closed her eyes, she knew that somewhere out there, under the same winter sky, they were both awake, the child and the man, waiting, perhaps unknowingly, for someone to listen. The storm came without warning, not as rain alone, but as a roar that swallowed the horizon, a voice of the sky that seemed to declare judgment on all living things. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, tearing at their branches, scattering dry leaves across the frozen ground. Thunder rolled deep and long, shaking the window panes of Evelyn's cabin until the lamp on her table flickered and dimmed. She rose at once, sensing something more than weather, a dread that pressed on the chest like memory. When she looked toward the west, where the faint glow of the Harlow ranch usually burned through the dark, she saw instead a restless shimmer of lantern light swinging wildly in the storm. Without thinking, she pulled on her cloak and stepped into the gale. The cold hit her like a slap, the snow cutting across her face in stinging ribbons. Each breath felt carved from ice. Her boots sank deep in the mud as she crossed the narrow trail that wound toward the ranch. Lightning split the distance, illuminating fences bent beneath the weight of snow, and for one breathless moment she saw the shape of a man running, James, his hat gone, his coat flaring behind him like a torn flag. The wind carried fragments of his voice through the rain, the sound broken but unmistakable. "Clara!" he shouted again and again, the syllables tearing apart in the thunder. When Evelyn reached the yard, chaos met her at the threshold. The roof above the porch leaked steady streams of water. The door slammed back and forth in the wind. Inside, the fire had nearly died, and rain dripped through the beams. Horses in the stable kicked and screamed, their bodies slick with sweat and fear. And through it all, one thing was clear. Clara was gone. Her little coat still hung by the hearth. Her doll's ribbon lay on the floor, but of the girl herself there was no sign. James stumbled past her, soaked and wild-eyed, mud splashed to his knees. She ran out, said she was scared. I turned for one moment. His voice broke mid-sentence. He tried again, but the words collapsed into a sound closer to grief than language. Evelyn grabbed a lantern from the wall, shielding it from the wind with her hand. "We'll find her," she said, though her own voice trembled. Together, they pushed out into the dark. The world outside was a blur of silver and black. The rain had turned the earth to a river of mud, the snow melting in the fury of the storm. They searched the yard, the stables, the broken shed near the well, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. James's lantern flickered, its light trembling across the puddles like a heartbeat. Every now and then they would stop to listen, hoping for the faintest cry. But there was only thunder and the low, unending moan of the wind. By the time Evelyn reached the far fence, she saw him drop to his knees in the mud. The lantern he held fell, rolling onto its side, its flame sputtering. He was holding something, a small object pressed to his chest. When she drew closer, she saw it. Clara's doll, soaked through, its single remaining arm limp in his grasp. James's shoulders shook, his breath catching in ragged gasps that were half sobs, half the desperate rhythm of a man running out of strength. Evelyn knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Not yet," she whispered. "You don't stop yet." He looked at her then, eyes wide and lost. "I told her she was safe," he rasped. "I told her she'd never be alone again." The words came out as if he were confessing to the storm itself. Evelyn picked up the fallen lantern, coaxing the weak flame back to life. "Then prove it," she said. "Let her hear you." Together they pressed onward, following the wind's cry toward the old barn at the edge of the property, the one long abandoned since the flood. The door hung open, banging against its hinges with every gust. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp straw. The lantern's light wavered over the walls, revealing shadows that shifted like frightened animals. Then, faintly, from the far corner, came the sound of breathing. "Clara?" Evelyn's voice barely rose above a whisper. The light trembled as she lifted the lantern higher. There, behind a pile of hay, they saw her. The child curled in on herself, her knees drawn to her chest, her small body shaking beneath a thin blanket. Her face was streaked with tears, her lips pale. When she looked up, her voice came in a small, broken whisper. "I thought you didn't want me anymore." James stopped where he stood. The lantern light caught the wet shine of his eyes. His lips parted, but no sound emerged, only a silence heavy with all the things he had never said, to this child or to the ones he'd lost. His hand trembled at his side. Evelyn felt her own throat tighten. She stepped forward, lowering herself slowly to the ground until her knees met the straw. "Clara," she said gently, her voice steady in the wind's howl. "Sometimes the ones who love us most are just too broken to show it." The girl blinked, confused, tears still clinging to her lashes. Evelyn brushed a damp strand of hair from the child's forehead. "It's not your fault they forget how to hold on." For a long time, no one spoke. The storm thrashed outside, the barn's rafters creaking under its weight. The lantern flame bent and straightened, casting trembling halos across their faces. James dropped to his knees beside them, his hand hovering uncertainly before resting on the girl's shoulder. "I'd never leave you," he said at last, his voice low and rough. "Not again." The child reached out, placing her small hand over his. Her fingers were ice cold, but she held tight. Evelyn watched the two of them, her own eyes glistening in the dim light. Something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness yet, but something close. A fragile mercy, tentative as dawn. The storm began to ease. Rain softened to drizzle, and the thunder moved farther away, grumbling like an old man retreating into distance. The horses outside quieted, their restless stamping fading into steady breaths. Inside the barn, 3 souls sat close to the trembling light of the lantern, one widowed, one haunted, one abandoned, each finding in the other some reflection of what they'd lost. Evelyn placed her hand over the child's back, feeling the rhythm of her shivering ease little by little. "You're safe," she whispered, echoing the very words James had once promised. Outside, the wind died down to a sigh. A single drop from the leaky roof fell onto the lantern's glass, hissing faintly, and then there was only stillness, the kind that comes not from absence, but from understanding. In that silence, the light flickered once more, painting their faces in gold before dimming. For the first time in years, Evelyn did not feel the weight of her own solitude. Instead, she felt warmth, faint, imperfect, but real, shared between 3 hearts that had all, in their own ways, been waiting to be found. And as the last echo of thunder rolled over the hills, it sounded less like judgment now, and more like release. Spring crept slowly across Willow Hollow, soft as a secret rediscovered. The snow, which had buried every sound and sorrow, melted into narrow silver streams that sang through the fields. Buds opened shyly along the fence lines, and patches of blue wildflowers appeared near the graves, trembling in the wind. The ranch, once haunted by quiet and grief, now pulsed faintly with laughter, Clara's laughter, rising like the first birds of the season. She followed James through the meadows, her boots sinking into damp earth as she handed him nails for the fences, humming under her breath, a tune she claimed Jasper the horse liked. Sometimes, when she laughed too loudly, even the old man smiled, and the house, that house of echoes, seemed for the first time to breathe again. Evelyn came often now, though she never said why. She would bring bread, or sewing needles, or simply the sound of her voice, filling the quiet corners with calm. She had grown used to seeing Clara darting between the horses, her skirt catching in the wind, her cheeks flushed with sunlight. It was on one of those bright mornings that the mailman arrived, a pale, stoop-shouldered man with chapped hands and a leather satchel that carried more bad news than good. He tipped his hat and handed James an envelope stamped with the seal of the county office. The ink was fresh, the handwriting precise and cold. James tore it open without ceremony. He read the first lines once, then again, his jaw tightening. The child must be returned to the orphanage. Mr. Harlow is not a legal guardian. Evelyn saw the letter tremble slightly in his grip, saw the way his shoulders straightened against the invisible weight pressing down. Clara, chasing Jasper across the yard, had not yet noticed. The sun shone on her hair, and for a moment, Evelyn wished time could stop right there, before the world remembered its rules. James folded the letter slowly, setting it on the table as though it might burn through the wood. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost detached. "They want her back." Evelyn said nothing at first. The wind slipped through the open window, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. Then she stepped closer, her hand hovering over his. "And you?" she asked. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table until the knuckles whitened. "I can't lose her," he whispered. For a long moment, the two stood in silence. An old widow and a weary cowboy, both too proud to cry and too human not to hurt. Finally, Evelyn laid her trembling hand over his, steady but kind. "Then you fight," she said softly, "not because you owe her a home, but because she has become yours." Her words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, fragile, yet full of truth. James nodded once, the smallest motion, but enough to light something in his eyes that had long gone dim. The courthouse in Willow Hollow sat near the river, a squat, red brick building with peeling paint and a clock that had stopped years ago. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was gray, and the air carried the promise of rain. Inside, the benches creaked beneath the weight of farmers, widows, and townsfolk who had come not from malice, but curiosity, people who remembered the man who once lost everything, and the child who had somehow made him whole again. Evelyn guided Clara through the narrow aisle. The girl wore a pale yellow dress that hung a little loose on her frame, her hair brushed smooth, her boots polished until they shone. In her small hands, she clutched Evelyn's shawl, a soft gray wool, frayed at the edges but warm from years of keeping hearts safe. James sat beside them, his hat resting on his knees, his face unreadable except for the faint tremor in his jaw. The judge, a man in his 60s with spectacles perched low on his nose, cleared his throat. His name was Judge Thorne, known for fairness, but also for the kind of tiredness that comes from seeing too many broken stories and too few second chances. "Mr. Harlow," he said, "the county claims you are not a suitable guardian for the child. You live alone, with no blood relation and no prior record of care." His tone was formal, but not cruel. James rose, removing his hat. "Your Honor," he began, voice rough but steady, "I may not have much in the way of schooling or paperwork, but I've got land, work, and love enough for one child. That's more than what most start with." The courtroom murmured, a mix of sympathy and skepticism. Evelyn watched him, her hands clasped in her lap, knowing every word came not from pride, but from a man's last defense against losing hope. The representative from the orphanage, a woman in a stiff navy dress, her hair drawn tight, adjusted her papers and spoke with a practiced gentleness that carried no warmth. "Love," she said, "is not always enough. The state has rules, Mr. Harlow, and this child needs stability, not sentiment." Evelyn rose then, uninvited. "And yet," she said quietly, "it was sentiment that kept her alive." All eyes turned. She stepped forward, voice trembling but clear. "I was there the night of the storm. That man nearly froze searching for her. Tell me, what rule can measure that kind of devotion?" The woman hesitated, flustered. The judge's brow furrowed. Silence settled heavy in the room. Then came a sound, small, wavering, Clara's voice. She stood slowly, still clutching Evelyn's shawl. "You asked who my family is," she said, her gray eyes darting between them. "It's them, the ones who stayed." No one moved. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop turning. For a heartbeat, all that existed was the child's trembling voice and the echo it left in the room. The judge leaned back, folding his hands over his desk. The lines around his mouth softened. "Sometimes," he said at last, "the law remembers mercy." His gavel struck once, sharp and final. "Custody is granted to Mr. James Harlow, and Mrs. Evelyn Marsh is to be named guardian, should his health fail." The words landed like sunlight after rain, slow, almost unreal. James exhaled shakily, his shoulders collapsing under the release. Clara turned to him, eyes wide, then flung her arms around his waist. He bent low, holding her close, the brim of his hat brushing her hair. Evelyn watched, her vision blurring, not from sorrow this time, but from the quiet awe of witnessing something mended. When they stepped outside, the rain had begun, soft and cleansing. The townsfolk lingered near the steps, whispering not with gossip, but with gentleness. Clara danced in the puddles, her laughter echoing off the courthouse walls. James looked at Evelyn, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "You were right," he said. "It wasn't about fighting the law." Evelyn shook her head. "No," she answered. "It was about remembering what love owes." They walked together down the muddy road, the lantern lights from the nearby shops flickering against the gray sky. And though the day was damp and cold, Willow Hollow seemed warmer than it had in years. At the bend, Clara reached up and took Evelyn's hand, her fingers small but certain. "We're going home," she said. Evelyn squeezed back. "Yes, darling," she whispered. "We are." As they disappeared down the path, the courthouse bell, long silent, gave a single, hesitant ring, as if stirred by the weight of the moment. It wasn't loud, nor perfect, but it was enough. The years slipped through Willow Hollow like slow water carving its way through stone. Seasons changed without ceremony, winters less cruel, summers gentler, the kind that ripened wheat and softened the hearts of those who had endured too much. The Harlow Ranch, once a lonely speck on the plains, now stood proud again, fences mended, stables filled, the fields brushed gold under morning light. Life there had settled into a rhythm quiet and true. The creak of porch boards, the nicker of horses, the scent of bread cooling on Evelyn's windowsill. The ghosts had grown tired of haunting. James grew slower with each spring. His hands, once sure and strong, now trembled when tightening a saddle strap. His hair had faded to the pale color of the clouds that gathered before rain. Yet there was a calm about him now, a steadiness that came not from strength, but from peace. He often sat on the porch at dusk, a blanket over his knees, listening to the wind move through the grass, not as a reminder of loss anymore, but as a song of everything that had survived. Beside him, Evelyn's hair had turned silver, her face mapped with fine lines like rivers carved by time. Her eyes, though dimmer, still held the quiet fire of a woman who had once defied the dark. And then there was Clara, no longer a child, but a young woman grown in sunlight and forgiveness. She moved about the ranch with a grace that seemed to belong to the land itself, her laughter echoing through the hills the way birds announce morning. She tended to the horses with hands both firm and gentle, humming as she worked, a melody that James said reminded him of rain after drought. Jasper, now gray around the muzzle, followed her faithfully, nuzzling her shoulder as if remembering the frightened child who once brushed his mane with trembling fingers. Each evening, when the chores were done, Clara would hum that same tune while preparing supper, her voice carrying softly through the open door to where James and Evelyn sat, watching the sun dissolve into red and gold. Sometimes, Evelyn would close her eyes, imagining the years as chapters in a single song, one of grief, grace, and the stubborn beauty of staying. One evening, when the light was thin and honey-colored, Clara appeared carrying an old brass lantern she'd found in the shed. Its glass was clouded, the handle rusted, but when she held it up, the flame inside flickered to life as if it had only been waiting. She carried it to the oak tree that stood near the barn, the same tree that had shaded generations, its branches strong as the faith that kept the ranch alive. James watched her from the porch, his hands clasped, a question in his tired eyes. Clara looped a rope around one of the lower branches, hanging the lantern so it swayed gently in the breeze. The light cast a warm circle on the grass, golden and soft. "So no one ever feels lost coming home," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The words seemed to reach beyond the yard, beyond the hills, as if meant for anyone who had ever wandered too far from belonging. James smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the lantern. "You ever think," he murmured, "that we were all just waiting for her?" His voice trembled at the edges, half laughter, half truth. Evelyn turned toward him, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The fading light caught her face, softening every scar grief had left behind. "Maybe," she said, "she wasn't the one who needed saving." For a long while, none of them spoke. The sun dipped behind the ridge, and the first stars came out, timid and slow. The lantern burned steady, its glow brushing the bark of the oak and the outline of the old barn, now painted in gold. A breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of lilac and rain-soaked soil. It moved through Clara's hair, through Evelyn's shawl, through the grass that had once been trampled by storms, and it felt, to all of them, like forgiveness. Jasper lifted his head from the corral, nostrils flaring as if to greet the night. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, low and patient. James leaned back, letting the chair rock gently beneath him, his breath slow, his eyes half closed. Evelyn reached out, her hand finding his, and they sat like that, two old souls bound not by years, but by what they had chosen to love despite the years. Clara joined them soon after, sitting at their feet, resting her head lightly against Evelyn's knee. The lantern's glow flickered across her face, the same soft gray eyes that had once looked up in fear, but now shone with peace. The night deepened, tender and blue. Fireflies began to dance across the meadow, their lights answering the lantern's flame like a quiet conversation between earth and heaven. In the hush that followed, the world seemed to breathe with them. The house, the fields, the distant line of the mountains, all of it belonged to the same gentle stillness, the same promise whispered by the wind. And when darkness finally settled, that single lantern beneath the oak burned on, not fiercely, but faithfully. Its glow was a small thing against the vast night, yet it was enough. Enough to mark the way home for anyone who had ever been lost. Enough to remind the living that even after grief, after silence, after years of wandering, love, once found, never truly leaves. Long after the house fell quiet and the last window light dimmed, the flame kept its vigil. From the porch, its reflection shone faintly in James's eyes before he closed them for rest. Evelyn watched a moment longer, whispering a prayer not of sorrow, but of gratitude. "Even now," she murmured, "the light still holds." The wind sighed through the grass, soft, forgiving. And under the boundless western sky, that lantern glowed steady against the dark, like a promise made and kept. Even in the loneliest places, love can still find its way home. There are stories that don't end when the last word is spoken. They linger, like a lantern left burning long after the night has fallen. This one was never truly about loss, or even redemption, but about the quiet ways people choose to love again, even when the world once told them not to. Some hearts break open not from pain, but from mercy. And sometimes grace doesn't come in thunder or miracles. It arrives in silence, in a trembling hand reaching out when no one else would. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to be found, to belong, and to keep one small light glowing for someone who's still trying to find their way home. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and share it with someone who still believes in kindness. And if you'd like to walk beside us through more stories of hope, don't forget to subscribe, and may the night be gentle to your heart.